Hi, class, and welcome back to our lecture series on existentialism. So, this is the second lesson or lecture. Last class, as you know, we talked about the different philosophers in existentialism: Soren Kierkegaard, the 19th century Danish philosopher; Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher; Martin Heidegger, the mostly 20th century, that is 20th century German philosopher. We talked about Jean-Paul Sartre, the person to really give the existentialist philosophy a name and turn it into a real movement. We talked about Simone de Beauvoir, the existentialist feminist 20th century philosopher who kind of takes up Sartre's philosophy and does some interesting things with it. Makes a lot of developments of her own as well. Albert Camus, the Algerian-born French philosopher, who published The Stranger and The Myth of Sisyphus and all of that. And we really just dealt with, last class, the style and some of the major contextual bits that are important to know when you're embarking on a unit in existentialism. So let's talk about what existentialism really is today. I've been able in my teaching to boil it down to four major themes. And the first is that existence precedes essence. The second is that of freedom. The third is that of absurdity. And the fourth is that of responsibility. And I think you'll see as we go along that each of these themes, one goes after the other. So freedom is implied by existence precedes essence. Absurdity is implied by a realization of one's freedom, and responsibility is sort of the end solution that the existentialists have as a philosophy of life. And so we'll go through each one of these and we'll talk about how these ideas are grounded in the movement itself, but we'll mostly really get into the ideas. So, as I mentioned, theme one in existentialism, and perhaps the most important theme, is what Sartre talked about in his famous essay, Existentialism is a Humanism. And I believe he gave that, initially that was a speech to a bunch of college students, and he was trying to explain that although many people have accused existentialism of being a gloomy, morbid, nihilistic, edgy sort of movement, Jean-Paul Sartre was trying to say that his philosophy of existentialism was humanistic. It was supremely concerned with the well-being of the individual. It was concerned with freedom and choice. It was an optimistic, a kind of tough guy optimism it presents, right? Not to lie to yourself, but to approach the world with a kind of honesty and sort of optimism that existentialism, if you really bought into the philosophy, would imply. So existence precedes essence. What does that mean? Well, Sartre was an atheistic existentialist, so he wasn't a believer in supreme authority. He was someone who believed that we were essentially alone in the universe, and that one really couldn't say anything about God. So Sartre was an atheist, and that meant for him that there was no supreme authority to predestine your life. You were not being watched over or looked over. There was nothing defining you. Sartre was very much the type of person who didn't believe you had a telos in the Aristotelian sense. You have to make yourself what you're going to be. So existence precedes essence. And why don't we quickly talk about what the word essence means? And so this is actually a dictionary definition. Essence is the attribute or attributes that make an entity or substance what it fundamentally is, and which it has by necessity, and without which it loses its identity. So it's the you-ness of you. It is some philosophers would call it would call it mind. Some theologians would call it the soul. Sartre preferred to refer to this you-ness as your essence, who you really are, in the sense of being. So essence in metaphysics is often synonymous with soul or spirit. Today we often call it the self or your identity, right, in the deepest, sort of most individualistic sense, not your superficial identity characteristics, but really who you are deeply as a self. For Sartre, this really was the most important facet of existentialism, this idea that existence precedes essence. What that means is what you are, your essence, is a result of your choices in the world, your existence, rather than the reverse. In other words, who you are is defined by the life you live, is defined by what you do. It's defined by what you decide to make yourself to be, given that you're a creature with free will, okay? So Sartre's point is that there is no pre-packaged inherent meaning in the universe that you somehow can discover the meaning of life. You can dig it up like an archaeologist. It exists. It's really out there. Sartre says, no, the world doesn't come pre-packaged with inherent meaning. A lot of people criticize the existentialists for being like almost intentionally sort of edgy and gloomy, like a teenager saying, oh, life is meaningless. Sartre definitely didn't believe that life was meaningless. The point of folks like de Beauvoir and Sartre and Camus was to say, life doesn't come pre-packaged. It doesn't come innately. It doesn't have an inherent meaning. What that means is that you give life the meaning that it has. Now, there are many philosophers who disagree that that's even possible, right? Many important conservative philosophers, for example, would argue back with the existentialists that you can't just give life a meaning. You actually don't have that power, right? But we won't have time to get into sort of the Socratic back and forth on this. I really want today to teach you the philosophy, and then in a later class next week, you can actually ask me anything about this. But today we're going to go over the ideas. So for existentialism, the sort of empowering thing about that is that you get to define who you are. You are not bound forever to be defined by some supreme authority who decides what you're going to be. You don't have your fate mapped out ahead of time. And so that's why freedom is such an important concept in existentialism. Another way of putting this, and this is what Sartre talks about in his essay, Existentialism is a Humanism, is one way of thinking about this is man exists, he's born, before he can be anything. That's why he calls it existence precedes essence, is that before you have your essence, you do exist, right? You're born into the world. You don't have a definition yet. You don't have an essence yet. Your essence is determined by how you live your life. So an individual is responsible for making himself or herself into an essence, for lifting themselves beyond the level of mere existence, right? The way that a brute, an animal, exists without a rational self-consciousness. So this is where Sartre basically tries to get deep into the weeds and kind of explain what he's talking about. He kind of uses Aristotelian language, and he offers the argument about an artisan and his craft, right? So basically, he says, when you consider a manufactured object like a book or a paper cutter, and that's the word he uses, but what he meant was scissors. This object was manufactured by an artisan who started from an initial concept. A pair of scissors has a telos, and the telos, so that would be the purpose or function, if you remember from ethics, the telos of a pair of scissors is to cut. So scissors are created by a designer to work in a specific way, to perform a specific function. If it doesn't perform that function, it's not a good pair of scissors. So if it doesn't fulfill its telos, to use the Aristotelian language, that its purpose is to cut things, if it can't do that, it is no good pair of scissors, right? So scissors and most things that human beings make, right, have a predefined essence before they even exist. You designed it that way. It wouldn't exist were it not for the function that it serves. And so it's made for a specific purpose, and then it exists, but it already had its essence, which is why it exists, right? So for scissors, essence precedes existence. But for Sartre, the opposite is true with humans. Existence precedes essence, okay? And that means, roughly, having found myself thrown into the world, and that's that concept I brought up last class of thrownness, I go on to create my own definition, or nature, or essence, or self, in a way that never happens with other objects or life forms. So we are always a work in progress. And Sartre even said at one point that you really can't even define someone's essence fully until you're at their funeral, and then you can talk about what they became with the life that they had. So just to go over that term thrownness again, because it's actually kind of important to Sartre's philosophy, the term thrownness was used by existentialists. And existentialists, by the way, came up with all sorts of unique words. Heidegger was really the first person to come up with all sorts of unique words to describe. Remember, existentialism is a philosophy for living. And so Sartre and others and Heidegger found that there just weren't enough good terms to describe the business of life, to describe all the unique situations that we find ourselves in, to describe our condition, right? So thrownness was a term, it kind of evokes that idea that when we're born, we don't choose to be born. We're not in some Rawlsian original position deciding like where we're going to end up. And so it's kind of this absurd thing that we realize we're just kind of chucked into the world through no choice of our own, sort of randomly. And then we find ourselves ensconced in a situation that we didn't choose. And the point of existentialism is to take responsibility for your life, to take responsibility over that situation, that everyone can make choices in the situation that they're thrown into. But the point of the term thrownness is this idea that it is kind of jarring, right? That you are, as I think Sartre put it, condemned to be free. You're thrown into this world. You don't come with a predefinition. You don't come with a design. You don't come with an essence. You have to kind of scramble, get on your feet and figure it out as you live. And for the existentialist, that's exhilarating, right? To use another term that Sartre liked to quote, we are beings in situation. So you are a being in situation. So the reason that Sartre came up with that term is to say we don't exist in a vacuum. When we're thrown into this world, we are thrown into an environment, to a social scene, to a particular time period, to a particular culture. We're placed under the scope of a certain political authority. We exist in a social and political framework, and we're interacting in that framework. And so that's another reason our essence can't be defined before we exist. And this was partly not only part of Sartre's rebellion against religion, but also against biological essentialism, is that he didn't believe we came defined. He didn't believe that there was a God that designed us, and he didn't believe that we were completely confined to our biology, although to some degree we are confined to our biology. So that's why I want to go over these two terms. These are important existentialist terms. The first one is contingency. For the existentialist, contingency means there's nothing absolute about our existence. There's nothing necessary about it. We're thrown into the world, and then we exist as a kind of fact, as a kind of contingent fact. It could have been otherwise, right? Had your mom and dad not met or whatever, it's possible that you wouldn't have existed, right? And so you're thrown randomly into this world contingently through no choice of your own. And there's no particular reason, moral or otherwise, for your existence. There's no one watching over you, making sure you haven't had any bad thoughts. And in this world, it's kind of scary because you realize you actually have the free will to make choices. Now, that term facticity, we all have to accept our facticity. One way of misunderstanding the existentialists, and a lot of people have in the past, is to say that the existentialists thought, oh, they're asserting this sort of extreme free will. We could do anything we want. We're not bound by anything. Biological essentialism out the window. That wasn't Sartre's point. Sartre didn't think that if you wanted to like fly, you could grow wings and fly. He acknowledged this thing called facticity, and he thought you have to accept it. So we're free, given the kinds of creatures we are, to use our reason, to make choices, to interact how we see fit. We're free to pursue our own happiness, as Jefferson would put it. But we are limited, and we must accept our facticity. And our facticity are all of the givens that apply to you, right? All of the concrete details against the background of which human freedom exists and is limited. So we don't have wings. We can't just flap our arms and fly. We can't do anything. People do come thrown into this world with certain talents. I wasn't given a talent for mathematics. I probably could get better at it, right? Human beings can learn. I believe that. But I don't think I ever could have become a talented mathematician. Although some other people are born extremely gifted in that area and maybe will not have the same level of verbal facility that some other people have. Some people are excellent athletes, right? They're born with these genes, the sports gene, to quote the book by Epstein, the sports gene. Michael Jordan has a talent that no matter how hard I try, I could never have. LeBron James has a height, he has a muscular definition, he has a talent that I'm just never going to have no matter how much I try. So you are bound, right? You are born into a certain geographical location that you might not be able to escape. You could be born into the context of World War II. You could be born in France during the occupation. And there are certain things that there is nothing, you can't escape the fact that you were thrown into that. So facticity includes the time and place of your birth, your language, your environment, your previous choices. For example, you've made choices in the past that you can't go back and change now, right? You can't change the fact of your existence, the fact that you're immortal, the fact that eventually you're going to die. So this is facticity. So Sartre's point wasn't that we're free to do anything in the sense of license or in the sense of transcending our the things that we're confined to, transcending our biology or our existential condition. Sartre's point was that there's a sense in which we can, if we have rational minds, we can always choose. And that because there's nothing determining who you are and what choices you're going to make in advance, because there's no map of fate, right? Like, I dropped this pencil. I could not have done otherwise. I'm a hard determinist. This was always going to happen from the dawn of time, right? That's called hard determinism, that literally everything's mapped out in advance and we have zero free will. Sartre's point is we can make choices all the time, and we do make choices. And one of those choices is to decide who we're going to become. And this is why Nietzsche had that famous quote, "Become who you are." Nietzsche didn't mean in advance you are something and then you have to get in line with that. There's this cliche in Western culture, right? Like to find yourself. Ooh, I just need to go off on vacation and find myself. For Sartre, there isn't really a self to find. There is your facticity. Let's say you're really good at mathematics naturally. You're naturally gifted at numbers, and you discover that, and you follow that path because it's a path to success. That's not what Sartre or Nietzsche meant. But by become who you are, Nietzsche didn't mean become who you are meant to be by some creator that throws you into the world. He meant go out into the world and figure out who you are. Create your own meaning. Figure out who you are by living your life. Do, right? Just do it, right? Go out and pursue a life project and become a real, authentic individual by living, right? So this is going to lead us into theme number 2, which is freedom. Now, Sartre, by the way, it's important to mention here, was a leftist. He was a Marxist, but he was kind of an old school Marxist. He didn't believe in taking away people's freedoms. He was very rosily optimistic that even in a Marxist framework, you could have radical freedom. He wanted probably regulation of the economy, and he probably wanted people to be taken care of in certain ways, but he really and truly did believe in freedom in the civil liberty sense. But there's another kind of freedom that Sartre talked about a lot, and that was a kind of philosophical, personal freedom, right? And so the definition that I have here, and I think it's a good one, is how we behave, how we think, how we see the world, how we choose, right? That is our freedom. It's the idea that nobody is your supreme daddy, right? Nobody is pushing you around or telling you what to do in that sense. You actually have freedom. And so Sartre was pretty extreme on this. Sartre thought that even if you were locked in a prison cell, you still have a certain freedom. Now, your facticity is that you're locked in a prison cell. You don't have complete freedom, but you still have freedom. Freedom to choose what you're going to think about. Freedom to choose the meaning you're going to make of this situation. Freedom to choose what you're going to think about. Freedom to choose how you're going to handle the situation. Okay, so Sartre's point about freedom is that there's no divine plan. There's no blueprint. You can choose to do anything, right? Given your facticity from within that framework, you get to choose how to live your life. There's no supreme guidebook. And the big thing about existentialism is that's actually really scary. The fact that you could say anything at any time, right? I like to bring this up to my students is that I have the freedom that I could say something right now that would get me fired, right? I could say something that would offend all of you right now and that would get me fired. I have the freedom to do that. But with freedom, with a kind of ontological, existential freedom, right? And by freedom, Sartre really means free will. With that free will comes responsibility. So the task for the existential individual is to accept his or her freedom and to take responsibility for it. You always have a choice. And remember, Sartre is writing in the context of World War II. He was watching people make excuses for cavorting with the Nazis. He was watching people make excuses for their complicity and their behavior, for allowing things to happen that shouldn't be happening. He would blame his fellow countrymen and women for not joining the underground resistance. So for him, what freedom meant at the end of the day is that you have no excuses. And there's a famous lecture series by Bob Solomon, who sadly passed away too early of a heart condition. But Bob Solomon labels, and you can just go on Amazon or Audible and actually buy the lecture series. It's called Existentialism, No Excuses. Meaning, look, if there were no such thing as free will, if everything was planned out in advance, there would be no way of praising or blaming anyone for their actions. So remember, we talked about this in our ethics unit, is that ethics presupposes free will. If there's no free will, there's no such thing as ethics. It would make no sense to blame someone for losing the big football game. At the same time, nobody gets to be a football hero. You don't get to praise Tom Brady for making all those good throws. It was always going to happen. And you also don't get to blame him for losing the game, right? There's an example that I like to use. Let's take a person who's like a total drunkard, like a total drunk. Let's say this person just has a really bad problem with alcohol and they're making the wrong choices in life. Now, if they suddenly got sober and changed their life radically, we would praise that person. We would say, you know what, that's heroic. The fact that you went to AA meetings, the fact that you stopped drinking, even though you were surrounded by alcohol, that took courage. You had the freedom to drink, but you didn't. And I'm going to praise you for that. But let's say now that I lock that same drunkard, that person who's ruined their life by becoming addicted to drugs or alcohol, let's say I lock them in a cage and they get the shakes and they have withdrawal and they become sober. Do I still get to praise or blame that person for what they do? Do I get to praise that drunkard for becoming sober? And the answer is no, he couldn't have done otherwise. So ethics presupposes freedom. You don't get to lock people in a prison cell unless they could have done otherwise. If it was always going to happen, then it makes no sense to lock someone up. Nor would you ever be able to make the choice to lock someone up. You always would have been locking them up. So ethics always presupposes that you have at least some degree of free will. It at least supposes compatibilism, right? So existentialists were obsessed with freedom. And they were especially obsessed with the kind of freedom that human beings have and that animals don't have. So existentialists were obsessed with the way in which humans, unlike animals, were able to rise above their evolutionary imperatives, their biological imperatives. Human beings are able to rise above their own pre-programming, their own self-interest. They're able to rise above their own social and cultural situations to make choices using their rational minds that distinguish them from animals, right? That animals have no rational self-awareness. So human beings do all sorts of things and make all sorts of free choices that we hold people responsible in civilization for the choices they make. We don't hold animals responsible for those same choices, right? Freedom is what human beings have. It's the ability to do otherwise in most situations, right? And And the same can't be said of animals. And this is actually where natural rights and natural law come from. Natural law derives moral rules deductively from certain facts regarding our nature. And one of those facts is we have a rational mind and we do make choices and we can choose. We can make abstract ethical systems. We can apply the golden rule, and we can say, I wouldn't like it if someone did that to me, so even though I'd like to do this, I'm not going to do it to them. Animals don't actually do that. Right, so here's a good example of the principle at work. When you sit down, I love to use this example just because it's something that typically goes unacknowledged. When you sit down and watch the Nat Geo channel and you see an animal ripping apart another animal, you see a lion ripping apart a gazelle, you don't call the cops, right? It might be a little gross, but you're not even really traumatized by it, nor are you going to go out and crusade for the rights of the gazelle out there on the Serengeti. Animals kill each other in the wild. There's animal rape in the wild. In fact, they show this on National Geographic, and you sit back and get a bowl of popcorn and you watched with relaxed awe. And the reason that you don't get outraged about this is that the animals cannot do otherwise. They're wild. They do not have rational self-consciousness. They don't have metacognition or language. They don't reflect on their actions. They don't square those actions with any kind of moral law or moral system. In fact, they can't. You can train an animal to be less vicious, but there's always an element of wild nature in them. And by the way, the training that you give them is fear-induced. It's a kind of Pavlovian behaviorism. You train the animal not to do what they do to get certain rewards. Your dog's able to behave the way you train your dog to behave because early on in the training, you made your dog afraid of what would happen if your dog didn't do what you wanted your dog to do. Human beings can actually follow moral codes without that kind of fear, right? A lion doesn't rip apart a gazelle and then sit down under a tree and think about what he just did. In fact, he can't do that. He doesn't feel remorse for it. He doesn't know it's wrong. He can't know it's wrong. He can't make that abstraction, and he cannot incorporate an abstraction he cannot make into a framework of moral action. But the rules for human beings are different. Human beings are free to choose. Human beings can learn that something is wrong, not out of fear or conditioning. We can learn that something is wrong and why it's wrong, and we can avoid doing that thing. And so if you see a human being murdering or raping another human being, you will call the police. You'll demand justice because the person being murdered or raped has certain rights that are being violated by another person who understands, knows about, and can comprehend those rights. And that's called responsibility. And that's a huge element in existentialism. And the reason that I'm bringing up this point and making this point is that human beings can do otherwise. Human beings human beings have freedom. They can act outside of their biological imperatives. I mean, you can call to mind situations like the Virginia Tech shooting, in which that tragic event in which all those people were shot, and in which a professor actually threw his evolutionary will to life aside and decided to jump in front of his students, jump in front of gunfire, to voluntarily die to protect his students. That is not something that animals will do. Animals might act out of a kind of loyalty to their master, out of a kind of aggression for someone who might harm their master. And certainly animals do risk their lives. Animals do protect human beings, for example, but it's not square. It's more instinctual. It's not squared with some sort of abstract moral law, certainly, right? And this freedom that we have, that existentialists like to talk about, it leads to a certain feeling that only human beings have. And I want to introduce you to a term called anguish, okay? Anguish is a concept. Sometimes it's called dread, sometimes it's called anxiety. But anguish is this feeling that arises from your acceptance and your understanding that you are free. The thing about freedom and free will is that when you realize that you're free to choose and that you're responsible for your actions and that you can't blame society, right, for what you did. Society made me this way, man. It was all just fate. It was meant to happen. No, existentialists say toughen up, right? It is scary, the fact that you have freedom. The fact that you have freedom means that when you do something wrong, it's your fault, right? And this for Kierkegaard, and I think he talks about this in his work, The Sickness Unto Death. Kierkegaard talks about the fact that one of the ideas that dominates the human mind, one of the fears, one of the sources of anguish that drives human behavior is the fact that we're all kind of afraid of our own freedom. So this idea of fear of one's own freedom is what Kierkegaard called anguish. And it's the realization, as I mentioned earlier, that nothing is holding you back, right? That you are responsible for your choices, that you could do anything, but that each of those different choices is going to have consequences. Anguish, according to Kierkegaard, is the idea that you are the one who must choose. So in Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard tried to make this idea clear by asking the question, have you ever had the experience of standing on a cliff edge and realizing that as you stand there, to your own dizzying horror, that what you truly dread is not the possibility that you'll fall to your death, but rather that you will throw yourself off? That's, Kierkegaard said, that is often why you're actually afraid when you're standing on the edge of a cliff, right? And this is what Kierkegaard called fear of one's own freedom. It's the fear that I could do anything right now, right? And that I actually have to be responsible for myself for not doing that thing, right? And this is a feeling that all people have. It's the fear of your own power, and it is a descriptive part of our condition. Now, please don't be confused. Sartre, Kierkegaard, they're not saying that you should feel this way. They're saying that human beings naturally do feel this way. And the moral consequence of this freedom that we have is that we are responsible for the consequences of our actions. And so becoming an existential individual to some extent is the project, and this is something that Camus and Sartre really believed, is the project of becoming a master of that fear, of integrating it within yourself. Now, there are sort of silly versions of this idea that have been played with throughout pop culture. There was a movie with Ryan Gosling and Sandra Bullock called Murder by Numbers. And they were these two like gloomy existentialist high school students who were reading Nietzsche and the other existentialist philosophers. And they were realizing that the way they were living their lives was very socially conditioned. They were ensconced in this social environment. They were making choices that seemed to be dictated from above. And their whole mission in this film was to truly prove that they were free, that they could do anything they really wanted to, and that they were free. And the way that they decided to prove that they were free, right? Because they were stuck in this position where it's like, yeah, I'm free to throw myself off the cliff when I'm standing there, but I'm never gonna. So am I really free? I'm never going to do that. So isn't there a sense in which the person who's standing there is just afraid of doing that, but they never would. So it's not like they ever really had the freedom to do that because they never would do that. And so these kids in Murder by Numbers are like, we're going to prove that we're free by killing a lady randomly, right? And that's what the whole movie's about. And eventually they're apprehended by a smarter detective in Sandra Bullock who figures out what they do. These teens go to a grocery store and they kill this lady for no reason to prove that they're existential individuals. And that's actually quite silly because the point of freedom, according to folks like Kierkegaard and Sartre and Camus, was to take responsibility for the fact that there is no plan, that there is no supreme moral authority looking over your shoulder, like your guardian angel watching over you, right? Is that you alone are to be praised or blamed for your actions. But the good thing is that there's a power in that. When you do something good in life, you get credit for it. When you do well on an assignment, you did that. You disciplined yourself. You earned that. When you got into Harvard or the state school that you always wanted to get into or whatever, you did that. When you get a job, you did that. There's nobody to blame but yourself. And that means that comes with responsibility, right? the real reason not to kill the lady at the grocery store, according to someone like Sartre, is because it's morally wrong. And as rational individuals, we do come up with moral frameworks for why certain things like murder are wrong, and those are valid, and those make sense, and we should respect those. Just because you're a good person and you're never going to do something doesn't mean you're free. It probably means that you accept the responsibility of your freedom, and you're not taking it for granted and abusing that freedom that you have, right? And so Nietzsche discussed this idea often as well. And we've talked about Nietzsche already. Nietzsche discussed this idea as well. Nietzsche, if you remember, was a 19th century German philosopher, and he was really interested in critiquing the moral systems that have arisen in the West, particularly Christianity, but also Judaism. He even criticized Islam and Buddhism. So he was someone who believed that we were thrown into this world and that we were free to chart our own destiny and, to quote him, to become who we are. And for Nietzsche, he came up with this interesting idea about morality. For Nietzsche, what people call morality and what people think morality really is, what people call their conscience, is simply anguish and fear, that thing that Kierkegaard talked about, masquerading as morality. So Nietzsche kind of a little bit agreed with those kids in Murder by Numbers. Nietzsche thought that morality was basically anguish, that people pretend that they're moral and that they act the way they act because they're good and because they follow a moral code and because they're innately virtuous and because they're guided by some internal moral sense. But they actually behave the way that they do out of fear and impotency. And so these kids in Murder by Numbers were reading Nietzsche and they were realizing, like, oh, everyone says you're not supposed to kill a lady because that's immoral, but what if we're just afraid to do it and we're repackaging our fear as morality? And Nietzsche kind of actually believed that, although he would never advocate killing another person and violating their human dignity. But Nietzsche was interested in this idea, and he was kind of worried that maybe our morality was derived from a place of weakness. He was afraid that we shouldn't build our moral systems. And there are many moral systems. You can be a utilitarian, you can be a deontologist, you can be a virtue ethicist, you can be a Christian. There are all sorts of different moral codes. And Nietzsche wanted to make sure, and he called this his genealogy of morals, where he wanted to look back at all the different moral systems and make sure that they didn't originate in fear, because a morality that's based on fear and weakness is not a good morality, according to Nietzsche. And so Nietzsche's point was that our morality is actually derived from a fear of our own freedom, from a fear of our own power, derived from a fear of doing what we know we want to do. So take stealing. For Nietzsche, the real reason that you don't steal isn't because you abstractly know it to be wrong and you would never do such a thing. It's because you're scared of what would happen if you did steal, if you took what you really wanted. So instead, out of weakness and cowardice, out of anguish, right, you don't steal, right? And what you do is you rationalize your failure to act on what you wanted by calling it morality. And so for Nietzsche, our moral systems, as we've built them in the past, were forms of morality built on cowardice. People who engage in these moral systems are acting in a herd-like fashion, and it's really a resentment and a revenge against those who get what they want. We're afraid to do what we really want to do, and then we act like cowards, and we justify our cowardice in a sort of feat of backwards rationalization by calling it morality. And for Nietzsche, moral systems like Christianity, like Judaism, he didn't discriminate. He didn't like any form of religion. Nietzsche was basically saying that people are eager to follow those religions because they're eager to learn that their cowardice in doing what they wanted to do was actually a virtue all along. And really, when they were behaving out of cowardice, they were actually being really virtuous, and they're really good people, and that moral systems make us feel good about ourselves, right? Moral systems tend to value the innate worth of the individual, and Nietzsche's saying that's not objectively right. we want that to be the case because we're afraid of living in a world in which you have to prove your own moral worth and prove your value. Now, I disagree with almost everything that Nietzsche says. I think he's a genius, really a brilliant person, and his ideas are contradictory and misunderstood. His real point was that he didn't think we shouldn't have a morality, but he was convinced that we could rebuild morality, that we could reevaluate morality and follow a new morality based not on weakness and fear, but based on strength, based on courage, based on will, based on confidence. And you could see how the Nazis would abuse Nietzsche's ideas and take it really too far. And in fact, when Nietzsche uttered the phrase, "God is dead," Nietzsche, a lot of people misunderstand that and pretend like Nietzsche was being some gloomy teenager who says things like, "God is dead," right? When Nietzsche said God is dead, his point was actually a much more nuanced and sophisticated one. Nietzsche's point by saying God is dead wasn't that there is no God, God is dead. It is, as society becomes more secular, and as people start to adopt a secular morality that's divorced from these ancient religious moralities, we're actually becoming unmoored from the only moral systems that we actually have. So Nietzsche was really worried that, because Nietzsche is kind of like what evolutionary psychologists who believe in group selection believe. Nietzsche believed that we were all hardwired to worship something. Human beings are going to worship something, right? And so Nietzsche was actually worried that if society became really secular and if everyone stopped believing in God, they would just replace their belief in God with belief in something much more dangerous. And Nietzsche is actually someone who predicted that in the 20th century, hundreds of millions of people would die as a consequence of what he called the death of God, which was society slowly becoming more secular and thinking that they could control their own destiny, thinking that they could impose their own code of morality, thinking that they didn't need to accept some long-standing, revised, reformed, carefully worked on, slowly evolving ancient system of religion that has attuned itself to the facts of life and to human nature. So Nietzsche had a reverence for religion, but he actually kind of thought he could do better. But Nietzsche was really worried about the fact that in the 20th century, and it turned out Nietzsche's prediction was 100% accurate. Right, the communists in many ways replaced their belief in God with the belief in the state and a belief in this sort of equality of outcome utopian society. Hitler was the same way. Hitler was very much obsessed with the folk. Hitler replaced any kind of belief in a religious God with belief in racial superiority, with belief in the race, with belief in blood and soil, with belief in the perfect German set of genes or whatever, or belief that in some kind of purified body politic. And so Nietzsche would have been disgusted by Hitler. He would have been disgusted by the communists who were basically taking their religious impulses and channeling them into something that was really negative and destructive. And so Nietzsche predicted that if we didn't really carefully think about what we wanted our morality to be, we would end up replacing our old moral systems with even worse ones. And that was Nietzsche's point. So a lot of people misunderstand Nietzsche. Anti-Semitism disgusted Nietzsche. Hitler would have disgusted Nietzsche, and he wouldn't have liked that at all. And he kind of predicted what eventually ended up happening. Okay, and so it looks like I'm going to have to make a third video, or we'll have to meet next week and talk about the last two themes, because we've only gotten through the first two themes, and we need to get to absurdity, and we need to get to responsibility, and we haven't gotten to those yet. And we also need to talk about the myth of Sisyphus. So you know what I'll do? I have an even better idea. What I'm going to do is I will assign you Myth of Sisyphus for homework, and I will have you read that over the course of the next week or so, as much as you can, and I'll probably even upload some videos for you to watch. And then next class, we will talk about absurdity, responsibility, and we'll talk about Camus' incredibly famous essay. It's been popular ever since he wrote it. You can buy it at Barnes & Noble in the form of a book, and that work is called The Myth of Sisyphus. And so we'll stop right here. That was the first two major themes in existentialism. I know that's a lot, but just to recap a little bit, what we went over today is the idea that the first major principle is that you create your own meaning in life. Life doesn't come pre-packaged with inherent meaning. Your existence precedes your essence. So you define who you're going to be. You don't have some master over you defining who you are or who you are meant to be or who you're going to become. You determine that through your life, which is exhilarating for existentialists. And then the second theme was freedom. It's the idea that we're thrown into this world. We do have free will. We do make choices in this world, but that just means that we have a huge responsibility. We have to take responsibility for our actions. We have to take responsibility for our freedoms. And it is only you, for example, that can be praised or blamed for your actions. And that's a scary feeling, is that you're in control of what you do. There's nobody to blame, and that you have to make the most of your life as it stands in front of you. And so I'll leave you with that, and I will update you on the Google Classroom, and see you next week.